Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Hello, welcome everybody. In this episode, we're turning the spotlight onto something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and that's the emotional impact that safeguarding work has on school staff. So we're discussing the issue of vicarious trauma in education. So I think let's start with the basics. When we talk about safeguarding in schools, the focus is usually on the child, and rightly so. But I think, Sarah, we need to look a bit beyond that. So let's think, what about the staff who support them?
Well, absolutely, exactly. DSLs, pastoral leads, teaching assistants, they're often the ones hearing the most difficult disclosures, attending multi-agency meetings and absorbing that emotional weight sort of day after day.
Yeah. And that kind of exposure doesn't just disappear when the bell rings. Over time, it takes a toll. And that's what we mean, I think, when we're talking about vicarious trauma, it's that, that psychological impact of hearing or dealing and managing other people's trauma.
Yeah, I think it's not just stress or burnout. I think it just cuts deeper. It can start to shift how someone sees the world, how safe they feel, how much they trust others, and even how they relate to family and friends.
Yeah. Well, the Teacher Wellbeing Index for 2024, that really shines a light on this. So, Sarah, it might be useful just to run through some of the statistics, the figures.
Yeah, well, the figures, they are stark. 78% of education staff said that they were stressed at work. 81% reported mental health symptoms caused by their job, and 72% described their workload as unmanageable.
And that's already worrying, but it gets more serious, doesn't it? More than half of staff, they reported that they felt their school didn't support their mental health well. And I think well is a crucial word there.
Yeah.
And 90% of senior leaders said they were stressed, with over half considering leaving the profession.
Now, imagine being the safeguarding leader, on top of that, you're holding multiple high-risk cases, you're managing disclosures, you're writing reports, liaising with external agencies. It's relentless.
Yeah, and it feels relentless. So what does this actually look like in staff? What are the early signs that someone might be experiencing vicarious trauma?
Well, I think it's subtle at first. Someone might seem more irritable or emotionally drained, even after a weekend or a holiday. They might start avoiding certain cases or pull back from pupils who trigger those difficult feelings.
Well, they may, I'm just thinking they may lose that sense of purpose, that they used to have.
Yeah.
Sleep gets disrupted. Worry becomes constant. It's underlying. Maybe they seem more withdrawn or more critical. But again, it's not about weakness. It's about the impact, isn't it, of just carrying too much for too long.
Yeah, and I think one area where education really lags behind social care and other sectors is supervision. Not everyone listening may be familiar with what that actually means in a safeguarding context, So I think, Sam, break it down. What does supervision mean?
Yeah, well, supervision doesn't just mean someone checking your work, and how you're doing your work. In safeguarding, supervision is structured. It's a structured professional support. It's regular. It's a safe space where staff can reflect on the emotional and practical challenges of their role, where they can talk through difficult cases and where they can offload safely.
It's really interesting because I don't know whether listeners and yourself, Sam, but the BBC programme Ambulance, where crews are dealing with trauma almost every call, they have a direct supervision call and meet up after a difficult case straight away to talk through that. And I think it's important to really stress it's not performance management. It's not staff appraisal. It's about giving staff time to think, to process, to be supported, to make better decisions as a result. And in social work and healthcare, it's standard. In education, still rare.
It is. And, I've got dual qualifications in health and education. And certainly when I've undertaken health roles, supervision is a very, very different thing. And it was actually hugely beneficial to be able to walk into a room, to speak to somebody who had absolutely nothing to do with my career progression, which I think is a crucial thing.
Yeah.
And who was experienced, so they could understand what you were saying, and actually just a safe place where you could say, I just don't think I'm coping with this very well, or just how are things going. And I always remember getting into, at one point, having a conversation where I just felt I wasn't managing and things weren't, going as I wanted them to go. And my supervisor said, "You're just treading treacle, Sam. You'll get there." And it was so empowering to be able to have that conversation without the worry of, if I say I don't feel that I'm working as I should be, that might mean the next time I want to apply for, a promotion or whatever, that's going to be taken into account. So I think that's really, really, really important. And supervision, it makes a huge difference, and done properly, it helps safeguarders maintain emotional boundaries, prevent burnout, and recognise when something's just too heavy to carry alone.
I know, and I think your example's really true there. It's got to be meaningful, hasn't it? Supervision's got to be meaningful. It's not a box-ticking exercise. And crucially, I think it needs to be separate, as you said, from that line management. Staff won't open up if that person's supervising them and also decides on their promotion or their pay progression. You're absolutely right, Sam.
Yeah, it's definitely a key point. If supervision is to work, it has to be about trust, about giving safeguarding staff that permission to say this case is really affecting me or similar without fear of being judged or penalised. So where do we start? We've identified that education, that sector is not as advanced with supervision. Where do we start with this? How can leaders create that culture where staff feel safe to say, I'm not okay?
Well, it starts at the top. If senior leaders talk openly about mental health, and others will follow. If asking for help is seen as professional and not problematic, then that trust begins to build.
Yeah. And it's not just internal. Schools need that access to external support, whether that's employee assistance programs, local counselling partnerships, mental health networks, or even liaison within a group of schools.
Yeah.
Where, I just think there's other options. Schools don't need to feel that they've got to provide themselves, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And I think staff need to know what's available. They need to feel confident that they can use it without that judgment or stigma.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I remember doing quite an intensive piece of work with a school, and they had actually arranged for an independent counsellor from outside the organisation to come in and provide, and you could book a slot. It wasn't a formal supervision structure, but it was a case of you could book a slot and talk to. And the staff were really, really reticent to access it, and it is all about putting something in that staff can trust, But, here's the truth. Safeguarding changes lives. But right now, I think it's coming at a cost to the people doing the work.
Yeah, and I think, vicarious trauma might not always be visible, but it is real. If we want safeguarding to be done well, we have to protect the people behind it.
Absolutely. I hope that this episode, for those listening, I hope it's a conversation starter. Take that conversation back to your school or to your trust. For leaders that are listening, I know you look after your teams, But just take a step back and think, is there something in what we've been discussing today that's made you think, maybe not, maybe I don't, maybe we don't do this as well as we could, or maybe we do need something that's more structured in place. Because when staff feel safe and supported, children are safer too. So if you're in a safeguarding role, and some of the things we've mentioned maybe feel very real, and you might feel you're struggling or just not managing as well as you could, please know you're not alone. Support is available. Have a conversation with your team. And also, let's keep this conversation going, because I think by talking about this, I would guess there's been quite a few people possibly didn't even know what we would be discussing when we said vicarious trauma and support. So I do think now we've started the conversation, let's keep it going.